And there's Anne. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Chen. I'll be moderating this session with author and writer Ann Hui, who is the author of Suey Nation. So what we're going to do is Anne is going to start off. She's going to talk about the book. She'll read a passage from it, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So if you do have something that you want to ask Anne, feel free to type it into the chat. I will be taking a look at those and putting them out there for Anne. But before we start, I do want to acknowledge that the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credits, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So with that acknowledgement, I would like to introduce you to Ann Hui.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Pei. Thanks so much for doing this. I'm really pleased to be here talking to all of you, but also super pleased to be talking to you, Pei. We connected like 7-8 months ago for the first time, and I know
it feels like a long time ago.
It feels like a really long time ago. It really was. It was in the before times, and I know that you have a connection, a personal connection to the material. So I'm really pleased it's you that I get to talk to today. So as Pei just said, I'm just going to start off by talking a little bit about the book, about where the idea for this book came from, and then I'll read a passage, and then I'm happy to answer as many of your questions as you have time for. So as many of you guys probably can guess just from looking at me, I am the daughter of Chinese immigrants. I grew up in Vancouver, but both of my parents come from China/Hong Kong. My dad was from a province in southern China called Guangdong, or sometimes known as Canton, and my mom is from Hong Kong, and they both came to Canada in the 1970s. And you know, growing up in Vancouver, something that I don't think that I appreciated enough at the time is that, you know, the Chinese food in Vancouver was just so incredible, you know, and my family, of course, ate Chinese food all of the time. And the beauty of growing up in a place like Vancouver is that even though we were eating Chinese food all of the time, that could always mean something different. You know, one day it might be going for dim sum with my grandma. The next day we might be celebrating somebody's birthday at some fancy banquet hall with, you know, glittering chandeliers and crisp white tablecloths. Another day we might be going to eat, you know, Chinese diner style food, where the waitresses wore those old-fashioned paper white diner caps. You know, and that's because the Chinese food in Vancouver is really, really good, obviously, but it was very diverse, even more so today, and represented just like all corners of China, and which we know is obviously a huge country, and is made up of so many different cultures and so many different traditions. So again, you know, Chinese restaurants in Vancouver just meant so many different things growing up. But every time I would leave Vancouver, we would, you know, maybe go on a road trip to a smaller town somewhere, and we would see these other kinds of Chinese restaurants that were just completely different from what I was used to. First of all, they had these menus that were filled with dishes that I, as a Chinese person, couldn't recognize. You know, I never heard of these dishes. Things like mugu gai pan, almond chicken, sweet and sour chicken balls, you know, and even when I would, as a Cantonese speaker, try to, you know, sound out phonetically the names of some of these dishes, like I couldn't reconcile them with anything that I knew personally. And beyond that, you know, there was this like sameness to these restaurants that really, really struck me. You know, they all seemed to be using the same furniture supplier. They all seemed to have the same decor. They had these, you know, they all had the red lanterns, the paper placemats that all looked like they had been printed at the same printing house, with the same font and the same, you know, design. They often had the same names, these restaurants. You know, it was often Fortune something, Garden something, Panda something. And I was just totally mystified by these places. You know, I didn't understand where these restaurants came from. I didn't understand how these people who looked so much like me and my family in Vancouver seemed to have lives that were so different from ours. and I couldn't understand where this food came from. You know, if this was Chinese food, then what was the stuff I was eating? And so I just remained kind of fascinated by these places all of my life. And then fast forward to 4 years ago now, 2016, I was working at the time, well, I still am, the food reporter at the Globe and Mail. And I pitched to my editors at the time the idea of letting me explore these Chinese restaurants further, specifically Chinese restaurants in small towns across Canada. So I proposed a road trip. I said, let me drive across Canada, 18 days in total. I would drive from Victoria, BC, straight across all the way to St. John's, Newfoundland, and basically look to answer 3 questions. Why is there a Chinese restaurant in pretty much every small town across Canada? Who are the people who run these restaurants, and what brought them here? So the Globe said yes, and I took this road trip, and this was March of 2016. Along the way, I met, dozens and dozens of Chinese restaurant owners. I heard incredible stories, and I learned the history of this cuisine. So when I set out on this trip, as I said, I was totally mystified by this food. I didn't know what it was. I couldn't reconcile it with my own experience. And so my way of kind of figuring it out in my mind at the time was that, this kind of chop suey Chinese food was fake Chinese. Certainly that was my bias going into this. But I learned on this trip, the history of this cuisine. I learned that these restaurants were started by men who were facing real systemic racism. They were facing laws that were put in place by the Canadian government designed to keep Chinese men out of the country and out of the general workforce. These men, of course, they weren't trained cooks. Most of them had come to this country to work on the railroad. And so even the ones who knew how to cook, if they knew how to cook at all, they wouldn't have had Chinese ingredients. They didn't have Chinese customers. They were mostly catering to and cooking for white customers who many of them had never tried Chinese food before. And so these men were facing all of these obstacles. And so they did kind of what I think any of us or most of us would try to do in that situation, which is that, they improvised. They used the ingredients that they had available, Canadian ingredients. They made up dishes that they thought might appeal to white palates. They took dishes that were vaguely reminiscent of Chinese dishes. They added some ketchup, they added some sugar, they deep fried things. And that's where chop suey was born. So, what I learned from this trip was that, for so long I had been guilty of turning my nose up at this food, but what chop suey really is and is this cuisine that's born out of this discrimination. It's, this really kind of creative response to something really ugly, out of something ugly, these cooks, these men created something really delicious. So let me just tell you a little bit about some of the people who I met on this trip. I met in Drumheller, Alberta, I met Peter Lee and his wife, Linda. They had moved to Alberta, I think 10 years ago at the time. And Peter was actually a trained Chinese chef. He had spent many, many, many years working in these very fancy Chinese restaurants in a city called Datong, which is near Beijing. And, he had spent so many years training in these restaurants that had thousands of space for thousands of customers. They had hundreds of chefs working in their kitchen. Every single one was highly skilled, highly trained. And then after all of that, he moved to Drumheller and had to retrain all over again and learn how to cook this entirely new Chinese food, ginger beef and almond chicken and the like. In Stony Plain, Alberta, I met the Choi family. They run the restaurant called Bing's. And William, the owner there, only works at Bing's part-time. And that's because his other job is working as the mayor Stony Plain. In Thunder Bay, I found a Chinese restaurant inside of a curling club. And just in small towns across the country, I found variations of this chop suey cuisine. I found these entirely made in Canada, sometimes entirely made in just this one tiny region of Canada dishes. These are things like fried macaroni in Quebec, how in Northern Ontario, if you order Chinese food, you get it with a side of toast. In Newfoundland, if you order chow mein, the noodles are not actually, noodles, but made up of thinly sliced green cabbage. That's because, of course, in Newfoundland, until relatively recently, they couldn't even, get noodles. And so, I traveled all over the country. I met all of these incredible people. I learned their incredible stories. And of course, it was only after that story was published in 2016 that I realized on a trip back home to Vancouver that my own dad had, unbeknownst to me, both of my parents run one of these Chinese restaurants in the years before that I was born. And, this was entirely new information. It was very startling to learn that my parents, had this whole part of their lives that I knew nothing about before I was born. It was really unsettling to realize that, there was so much of my own family's history that I didn't understand or know, and that I hadn't really bothered to dig into. And so that kind of set me out on the second piece of this journey that's detailed in the book, which is, to learn my own family's history. And, what I learned is that my family, like so many other families, had a little bit of a secret. I learned that just like the story of this cuisine, of this chop suey cuisine, that my own family story, hidden within it, is actually this really important and I think fascinating piece of our country's history that so many people, I think, don't yet know. And it's this really kind of, I think, essential piece of our history, even though it's often glossed over or sometimes relegated to kind of being a sidebar in our history books. And I think it's one that's completely essential for all Canadians to know in order to understand who we were and where we might still go. So that's me rambling for 13 minutes. And now I'm just going to start reading a passage from the book, and then I'm happy to take all of your questions. So the passage that I'm about to read takes place in Victoria, BC. And Victoria was actually, as I mentioned earlier, the very first stop of the road trip. So this would have been March, I think 20th, 2016. And when I talk about, no, I'm just going to start reading. So this is Victoria, spring 2016. The last time I visited this Chinatown, I had winced at the carved dragon archways, the little pagodas topping the phone booths, and cheap chow for sale everywhere. I was struck by the shops and businesses that seemed to offer only souvenirs for tourists. It had felt like a museum rather than a working Chinatown. They were selling this idea of Chinatown, I complained. I pointed at the colored paper parasols, Hello Kitty knickknacks, and Japanese kimonos. It was all fake Chinese. Even the street signs were printed in that wonton font meant to evoke Asia. Meanwhile, the Chinese characters printed on the street signs on every sidewalk corner were nonsensical, phonetic approximations of the English ones. They looked and sounded Chinese, but didn't actually mean anything. They seemed like the perfect metaphor for this place. But this time around, I had mellowed. I understood now the fate of other Chinatowns across North America, how many, including Vancouver's, had been left struggling in the wake of Chinese immigration, moving instead to the suburbs. In the case of Victoria, many of the city's Chinese left altogether, departing for larger cities such as Vancouver or Toronto. Since the mid-20th century, Victoria's Chinese population had been gradually dwindling. So locals banded together, restoring historical buildings in the area and rebranding the area as a tourist destination. Now I could see that the Victoria business owners were just being pragmatic and selling what they could to stay afloat. As we made our way back towards the western edge of Chinatown, we saw how some of the businesses gave up on the Chineseness entirely. We walked past old buildings and storefronts that have been converted into hipster coffee shops and offices for tech startups. On the western end of Fiskard was the restaurant I'd been looking for. Both sides of Fiskard were littered with restaurants and shops, but one had always stood out from the rest, with its retro neon signs and flashy decor. We stopped in front of it, taking in the details. The white sign was designed to look like a paper lantern with the name Don Me etched in a thick black wonton font. Underneath, in red neon lettering, seafood, Sichuan, hot iron plate. I'd always been curious about the place. I left Anthony on the sidewalk and hiked up the flight of stairs to the restaurant. The dining room was sprawling with dozens of tables covered with white tablecloths. The napkins were flame folded and stuffed into water glasses. Waistcoated servers wandered around the room. It was late afternoon, after the lunch rush, but there were still a few tables with customers in the large dining room. Some were obviously tourists, white couples with guidebooks lying on the table next to them. But there were a few Chinese families there too, having late afternoon dim sum huddled over cups of tea. I picked up a menu laying on the counter by the entrance. The restaurant had all the classics of chop suey cuisine, the crispy spring rolls, kung pao chicken, and wonton soup. But they also had all the dishes my parents might order too. They sold the shredded jellyfish appetizer I loved, cold, stringy strands of jellyfish bathed in sesame oil, chili, and vinegar. They also had the fish maw soup my sisters and I hated growing up, not because it was made of fish bladders, which we didn't even realize, but because the spongy, chewy texture reminded us of dish towels. It was a delicacy, Mom and Dad claimed. In my mind, a Chinese restaurant had always been one or the other, authentic or not. But Don Me seemed to be both. The restaurant had weathered over 80 years in Victoria. It had seen many generations of Chinese immigration and many versions of Chinatown. And whether by design or out of self-preservation, the restaurant had reinvented itself over and over again. The middle-aged woman standing behind the counter eyed me up and down, glancing between my business card and my airplane rumpled appearance. I spoke to her in English first, then switched to Cantonese when I saw her confused expression. I told her the reason I was there and my plans to cross the rest of the country to visit Chinese restaurants just like this one. She wrinkled her brow, staring at me skeptically. At last she spoke. Everyone here is busy working, she said in Cantonese. Someone will call you. The look she gave me reminded me of the young woman at the rental car desk, that mixture of amusement and skepticism. It was clear no one was going to call. As I walked out of the restaurant, I wondered how many other restaurant owners would wind up responding to me in the same way. As a reporter, it was a doubt I was already well acquainted with. It was a question I thought about often. Each time I approached a new community and asked to speak with its leaders. A question I thought about each time I asked to speak with someone who had nothing to gain by speaking with me. And it was a question I knew I would carry with me into every one of these restaurants. When the restaurant owners first set eyes on me, they would see in me someone who looked a little bit like them. But from the moment I introduced myself, they might also see the opportunities I'd been given that they hadn't. I was born in Canada. I grew up speaking English. I got to go to university, then graduate school. In most cases, we were only a single generation apart, but I had been given so much. And now I was walking into their lives and asking for more. Who was I to walk in and demand to know people's stories?
That's great. And so I read the book actually, I'm trying to think, when I met you in February, I was going on a vacation shortly after that. And that's when I read your book on the beach. And it really resonated with me, as you mentioned, because my family also being immigrants, but to Nova Scotia, so to the other coast, and having worked in Chinese food as well. And I know a lot of people who have similar stories. The more you put out on social media, the more people of our age say, my parents had a restaurant, whether it was only for a couple of years, or my dad was a cook in a restaurant. And there's so many people like that. So I do encourage people who are curious and want to ask you a question. I'm opening up the chat on my phone so I can keep an eye on it if they have questions for you about your trip coast to coast, or about your family. I guess I'll start off by saying you stopped in so many places across Canada. You met so many people, so many families. Was there anyone or anything that you didn't manage to put in the book that you remember?
Oh, so many. Like I mean, it was 18 days on the road. It was easily 2 or 3 restaurants and families each day. So just dozens and dozens of people with really kind of amazing, incredible, inspirational, sometimes heartbreaking stories. And, you know, probably my hardest task was just figuring out which ones to use. And often it wasn't, you know, it was often just because too many stories were similar, or, you know, I wanted to have good regional representation. So again, the ones that didn't make it in the book, it had nothing to do with the, you know, quality or how interesting I found the stories. It was often just having to make kind of bigger picture choices. There were, I've heard quite a bit from people in Quebec, because I don't think I managed to get any stories from Quebec into the book, which is a great regret. For those who read the original Globe and Mail story that the book was born out of, I did have a story from a restaurant owner in Quebec. So I do regret not being able to include his, because, you know, his was one of the stories that really showed the potential kind of downfalls of this restaurant world. You know, he was heavily leveraged in the business. He was working a lot of hours, not seeing his family. You know, things weren't really working out the way that I think he had hoped. You know, for all of the restaurant owners I met, you know, the thing that they all had in common is that they had all made this gamble. You know, they had taken this bet to often usually leave one part of the world and come to this brand new country where they don't speak the language, where they don't know how to do a lot of the things they're expected to know, and to start this business. And it's this kind of crazy leap of faith that they're taking, in hopes that it's going to pay off, that it's going to lead to a better future, if not for themselves, then for the next generation, for their children. And, you know, in the case of the business owner in Quebec, I know things were, again, you know, the bet wasn't paying off. So it was unfortunate I wasn't able to fit that piece in. There was another similar story in Northern Ontario, of a small restaurant that also seemed to be definitely struggling. You know, I remember walking into this restaurant. It was, you know, dusty windows, dusty curtains. There was one table that was occupied with a couple who looked like they had been there all day. You know, they were each of them nursing a beer that was probably warm, reading the paper. The town was almost completely shuttered. It was just one of those towns where, you know, they had been a one company town, and that company had moved on, and, you know, the town was just kind of left reeling in its wake. And, you know, I remember talking briefly to the restaurant owner there and explaining why I was there, and she just wasn't interested in talking to me. And it felt like she was ashamed to have been found, you know, and embarrassed to share her story. And in that case, it was a choice not to include the story. You know, as a journalist, that probably makes me, it may not have been the right call, but it just seemed like a betrayal in some way to include that.
Of all the dishes that you tried and discovered during your travels, I'm sure many you were familiar with, and you probably, I'm going to guess, when you set out on this trip, you had expectations of what you might find along the way. But can you talk about some of the dishes that surprised you? And then when you heard about their origins, you just thought like, wow, this is so interesting because as you mentioned off the top here, a lot of them are very regional, very specific to that town or that province.
Yeah, this might come as, I mean, probably not to you, Pei, but this might come as a surprise to others that, this food, this chop suey cuisine is not food that I grew up with. So much of it is still surprising to me, even as a 30-something-year-old. I don't think I had my first chicken ball until I worked on this project 4 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah. And that also could be a regional thing, because I think chicken balls are less common out west. But yeah, a lot of this food was new to me. And then, as you said, as I traveled across the different parts of this country, I found even more dishes that were, I think would be new to a lot of people. Fried macaroni was fun, for sure, in Quebec. So that's basically, for those who haven't had it, it's basically like any stir-fried noodle, only instead of like an egg noodle, they use pasta, elbow macaroni in this case. There was ginger beef, which was also new to me, which also might be surprising to people, because I learned from doing this trip and this project that it is, ubiquitous, definitely out west, but really across the country. And then I was even more surprised to learn that, that is a made in Canada invention. It's one of those dishes that was, a really great idea, invented out of one restaurant, and then, just as all great ideas do, managed to just kind of spread like a spider web across this entire country very, very rapidly. And we can talk about this further if you want later, but really, what Chinese restaurants are really, really great at doing is replicating, creating facsimiles of great ideas, and then rapidly spreading across the country and really around the world. So ginger beef was a fun surprise as well. And then I think the story that I always tell is the Newfoundland chow mein, which I briefly mentioned earlier. I just love this idea of this dish. And so I walked into this restaurant. This was Deer Lake, Newfoundland. And on the door, they had a sign that said, "Our chow mein is made with cabbage." I didn't know what that meant. And so I asked the restaurant owner, and he explained to me that in Newfoundland, if you order chow mein, if it just says chow mein, even though chow mein literally in Cantonese means it's chow mein, which means fried noodles, you get no noodles. It's instead this Newfoundland only specific thing, which came about because, again, until relatively recently, even a decade and a half probably ago, maybe 2 decades ago, in Newfoundland, which is an island where even today many ingredients are difficult to access. A lot of fresh produce can be difficult to get at certain times of year. They weren't able to get things like soy sauce, things like egg noodles, things like oyster sauce that we could easily pick up here in Toronto. And so those first Chinese cooks who started these Chinese restaurants wanted to be able to serve chow mein because it's a Chinese food staple. And so some of the cooks there came up with this brilliant idea of taking cabbage and slicing it into very thin strips so that they kind of look like noodles. And then just, stir frying them up with a bunch of other stuff and calling it chow mein, so much so that, even today in 2020, if you go to any Chinese restaurant in Newfoundland, unless it specifies otherwise, chow mein is still green cabbage.
And that's, I think that goes to what you said about what you know about chop suey food is kind of what you grow up on or what you know about Chinese food. Because I'm sure if you grew up in Newfoundland, you'd be like, yeah, chow mein is cabbage. Like it wouldn't cross your mind that it would or should be something else. What did you taste that you remember really well during your trip?
Oh, I can still remember the taste of the Newfoundland chow mein. This was, because we went west to east, this was one of the last days of the trip. And so I had spent, the 16, 17 days prior to this eating a lot of deep fried food, eating a lot of, meats that were slicked in really sweet sauces. And so I think that part of me was just really grateful to eat a whole dish of vegetables. That was really nice. I also happen to like green cabbage. I know that's maybe not, it's not the sexiest vegetable to most people, but cabbage has this like really kind of deep but mellow flavor. I hate to say umami because it's like, I cringe when other people use that word, but it definitely has that. So it just added this really kind of nice like mellowness to the dish, and the texture worked kind of perfectly well. So I say to people, it's like carb free before its time.
Mm-hmm. And I know that the woman that you met at Fogo Island, she was so interesting, that chapter of the book. And I think a lot of people probably remember her really well because she ran that restaurant by herself. I believe she was likely the only Chinese food restaurant there. And I think in the book, you even asked her, are you the only Chinese person? And she was like, yeah, probably. So her story was one where I thought it was interesting because in a way, you almost feel a bit sorry for her. Like she must be so alone. She's by herself. Her children are not with her. Her husband is not with her. How sad to be so isolated. Yet you left there with a bit of a different perspective. And I know that you met her daughter later on. Is that right?
Yeah. So the woman you're talking about, her name is Huang Fengzhu, and she runs this restaurant called the Guangtong in Fogo. And I don't know how much people know about Fogo Island, but if you know anything about Fogo, it is an extremely isolated place. Here we have an island that is off of the east coast of Newfoundland. So an island province, an island off of an island, easternmost edge of this country. Really, when you're standing there, you feel like you are on the edge of the earth. In fact, flat earthers believe that Fogo Island is one of the four corners of the earth, which again just goes to show how remote and isolated this place is. It's an island of 2,000 people, but I think that includes people who are only there seasonally. So it's a very small place, very remote part of this country, incredibly, again, isolated. I keep saying it, but I really can't overemphasize how kind of remote this place is. And I find this Chinese woman who's running this Chinese restaurant in this tiny village in the middle of what feels like nowhere. She is the only Chinese person on this island. She doesn't speak a lot of English. She, as you said, lives alone. You look at the facts of her life, lives alone, doesn't speak the language, works every single day of the year. It just all sounds really kind of heartbreaking. But I went in and I talked to her, and I, learned her story over the course of a day. And, what I learned about why she wound up in this place was pretty much the same story that I heard all across the country, which is, I did it for the kids. We did it for the kids. She and her husband had chosen to separate and basically live in two different towns in Newfoundland, because two restaurants could mean two incomes, which meant that they were able to put, all three of their kids through university, and in at least one case, a master's degree. And so it was this story, we did it for the kids, we did it for a better future. And she was showing me, photos of her kids' high school graduations, of her kids' university graduations. She told me about how one of her daughters lives in Halifax, one of her daughters lives here in Toronto. Her other son at the time was just about to graduate from university in Newfoundland. And far from being this really kind of sad and and depressing and heartbreaking story, she was totally filled with joy. She was totally filled with pride, and rightfully so. And I think that her story just totally exemplifies this whole Chinese restaurant experience. You mentioned my going to meet her daughter after the fact. So this was a year later, after I had finished my road trip, after I had learned of my own family connection to these restaurants. And this was also after my father had been diagnosed with cancer. And so I personally was on this very, specific and limited timeline to learn my family story before it was too late. And something that I was really struggling with, something that I still struggle with to this day is, I was and have been the recipient of all of this sacrifice. My parents, just like Stacy's parents, just like so many of these Chinese restaurant owners, had just worked and worked and worked and worked. They hadn't spent any of the money that they had managed to earn on themselves. Many of them hadn't taken vacations. They did it all. My parents, as I was growing up, never bought new clothes for themselves. They would wear hand-me-downs, and these weren't even hand-me-downs from other adults. They were wearing hand-me-downs from my sisters and I after we had finished wearing the clothes they had bought us. And so, I had been on the receiving end of this experience that I just talked about, and received all of these amazing opportunities that I touched on in the beginning when I was reading this book. And I was really struggling with what to do with it. To have all of this privilege and sacrifice bestowed upon me, and to be here in what turned out to me my dad's last months, how I could ever try to pay him back. So that was kind of the conversation that I had with Stacy, or tried to have with Stacy, because there was a lot of it that I don't think I was even able to articulate at the time. But I think that it's one that a lot of children of immigrants probably can relate to. I'm not sure that I landed on a very good and specific answer at the time. I'm not sure that I've completely landed on an answer even now. I wrote a book about it instead of having to actually sit down and talk about it.
We do have a question. The story of the family in Fogo Island, you mentioned that they were looking to move to Ontario after your article was released. Do you know if they did?
Good question. Yeah, so at the end of, well, I don't want to give away too much, but the idea was supposed to be that she would retire. They would both retire. As far as I know, they haven't. And this is as recent, my information is as recent as last year, because Stacy, their daughter, came to the book launch. So she's still working. One update though, and I think a happy one, is that she's no longer living alone. Her youngest son, Richard, again, at least as of last year, moved in with her. He finished his undergrad and decided to move back in and help out his mom. So there is that piece. But as far as I can tell, she's still working.
I guess because the book and your trip was 4 years ago, and as we know, a lot can happen, well, in 1 year, let alone 4 years. Have you kept in touch or kept tabs on a lot of the people in the families that you profiled?
I've tried to. I've tried to, with varying degrees of success. Some of them are in pretty remote places, and I struggled to communicate with even at the time I was interviewing them. People like Peter and Linda, who I mentioned earlier, Drumheller, they spoke Mandarin, which is not my which is a learned language for me. My parents speak Cantonese, which I'm like medium fluent in. Mandarin is like 2 years of university classes, so it's not great. So in some cases, I've done a poor job of staying in touch with them. In others, and this is mostly just the restaurant owners who speak English, I have stayed in touch with mostly via social media. So, William Choi in Stony Plain, Alberta, we're Instagram friends.
How's he doing?
He's still running the town.
Yeah.
He's doing really well. Norina, who runs the Chinese restaurant inside of the Curling Club in Thunder Bay, Norina Karshti, she and I are Facebook friends, and she actually came to Toronto last year. They make like an annual trip down here for a convention, and so we met up for coffee. I've been watching with great interest both of their social media updates during the COVID, during this whole COVID situation. And they both seem to be adapting very well. They both are offering obviously takeout and delivery, which is, the case with most restaurants. Norina in particular is interesting because at Ling Li's in Thunder Bay, her restaurant was previously mainly buffet only. And so she has had to pivot. But in her case, it's been really interesting because she actually seems to be quite happy about that. She always felt like with buffet restaurants that there was just so much waste at the end of the day, and she just hated having to get rid of all of that wasted food at the end of the day. And but she had to continue doing it because in at least in her community, a buffet is what people expect at a Chinese restaurant. So COVID has actually worked out in her favor. But yeah, it's really hit or miss. I mean, I did get in touch with every single one of the families that's mentioned in the book before the book was printed. And so and I sent them all copies of the book. And so they all know about the book and they're all cool with being in the book. But yeah, since then, I haven't managed to stay in touch with every single one.
Well, that would take a lot, I guess. And I do wonder as well, because of COVID and in light of this year being so different than, any regular year, let's say. So, for the Chinese community, it's been a difficult one. For restaurants, it's been a particularly difficult one. And I wondered, especially in those small towns, how some of them have fared, what has happened, because there were a lot of them who had young kids and they would have been in school, or, it's not so easy to just pack up and go. And so if you were to ever would you ever consider doing it like an update?
It's an idea. Yeah, it's an idea. I get asked a lot if I would do another story or another book on Chinese restaurants, and I'm always like, no, enough. I love the subject area, obviously, but I had no intention of doing another book on Chinese restaurants. But the idea of an update based on just kind of COVID, I think there's something there. I am, of course, on mat leave. I had a baby 6.5 months ago, so my mind is not completely focused on work at the moment. But never say never.
Well, it was also, it was a grueling trip in many ways. You packed a lot into 2 weeks.
I don't even like saying it was grueling because really it wasn't. I mean, it was a blast. How many opportunities do you
I was just trying to make it sound hard. I'm like, it was
right.
A lot to eating
so
this Chinese
awful.
food.
I have to travel and go to all of these places. I wouldn't otherwise
eat a lot.
Eat all of this food. No, it was great. It was an amazing opportunity and I loved every bit of it. It was more after the trip, it was actually several weeks of writing the Globe story. And then after that, it was another, I think, 1.5 years, maybe even 2 years of working on the book version. And this was on top of all of the family stuff going on, and my dad being very sick, and then, writing about it. And so it was living the stories of the restaurant owners in my mind. And all of these stories that I loved, and these people who I care about a lot, still care about a lot, and just wanting to honor their stories, and of course not let down my own family in telling their story, and then just carrying that for several years. That's the part that I am not looking forward to, or do not relish the idea of repeating anytime soon.
I'll just remind people that the chat is open so people can ask questions. There's a question here, directed at me. Since you mentioned that your family ran a restaurant in the Maritimes, how did this book resonate with you personally? I mean, I think growing up in a small town, Sackville, Nova Scotia, as the only Asian family and the only Asian kids, you're aware that other Asians exist. You're aware there are other Chinese restaurants. Chinese restaurants at the time in the Maritimes in the 80s, there were some. It was takeout food. So I knew chicken balls because my mom had to make chicken balls. So I definitely knew what they were, and I thought that was Chinese food. I thought egg rolls were Chinese food. We just never ate it at home, which was what I thought was interesting. I'm like, we only eat it at work, or like when we go to work with my parents. And I think, as you mentioned, Anne, like, you relate. There are all these people, and they all have unique stories, but they have this common thread, which is doing something for their kids, for a better life, for more opportunities. And that's not their background. My mom never knew how to cook. So here she is trying to improvise in a place where she doesn't know anyone, where she doesn't speak the language, where ingredients are different to find. And, reading the book, you realize how much you share, or how much of your parents you see in these families that you profile. And then when they talk about their children and what they want for their kids, that's, some of that pressure that I got growing up, which is, well, you will go to university. That's why we did this, to, afford you this opportunity. And I think what you spoke to as well, and there's that little bit of guilt sometimes, which is, I watched my parents, especially the early years. We didn't have a lot of money. There was obvious struggle. They worked every day. They worked long days. We didn't do vacations. That was just something we didn't do. We didn't ask about it. My parents never had new clothes. I had weird hand-me-downs from other people. But then as you get older, and maybe as your life gets a little bit easier, there's that, you realize, oh, okay, yes, I have had a good life. I've been able to, I have a nice home now. I worked for it, but my parents have helped me. And there's that little bit of guilt of, have I done enough? Have I lived up to what they would have hoped? And I think it's nice to know that, not nice to know that everybody shares a bit of that guilt, but it's common, I think.
It everything that you just said, and beyond that, it's also that, we now have these nice lives that, as you said, we work hard, but also we've been helped a great deal. And at the same time, I can't speak for your parents, but at the same time, for me, my parents never really kind of stopped living in that way, where they were still kind of sacrificing of themselves, still kind of scrimping and saving. With my parents, it was more of a mentality. They had, certainly by the time I was working on this book, more than what they needed, just to get by. They were quite comfortable, but they were still living in this way where they were, felt like they couldn't spend money on nice things for themselves. They felt like they couldn't do anything for themselves, and so it's that on top of everything else.
Another question: has anyone reached out for a movie or a documentary adaptation?
Yes. I don't know if I don't think that there's any reason why I can't say it, but I also just don't know what the latest status is. But there is a film production company that purchased the the option on the book to potentially turn it into a film or a documentary. But I don't actually know where that's at. I haven't spoken with them in a number of months. And I do think that there is a time limit on how long they would have to potentially produce something. So I'm not sure where that's at, but there's definitely been interest.
Is that something you would like to see happen? Like, is that an interest of yours?
Obviously, I'm open to it. You know, I'm very happy with the team who did purchase the option. I'm so not a film person. I don't even know the right term.
It's like they have the, yes, I understand what you mean. Like, yeah.
I like them very much and I trust them. And that was why I decided to go ahead with it. I just have had a very good feeling about them. So yeah, I'm totally open to it, provided, you know, again, it's the right people, it's the right hands.
I think we're going to wrap it up soon, but is there anything else you wanted to share about that trip, about that book, about writing it?
I mean, the book is it's a piece of my heart. It sounds so lame to say that.
No, it doesn't. I think it's honest.
Yeah, it was like 3 years of my life. It is a subject matter that I have honestly been interested in my entire life. Chinese food, I have always found fascinating. I love eating. I love learning about. And then these specific restaurants, I just think are just like such a fascinating kind of nexus between history, between culture, personal stories, and then to have this personal connection and to be able to use this food as a vehicle to tell my own family's story. It's just, it was a blessing. I'm so grateful that I got to do this project. I'm so grateful I got to learn my dad's story and to tell my dad's story in this way. And so I'm just grateful to everyone who reads it and allows me to share a little piece of my family with them.
It's a perfect way to end it. Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you to everyone too for joining us today. And if you haven't read the book, then you absolutely should, because I think it's a great look into Canada's food and immigration history. You really covered a lot. So thanks, Anne.
Thank you.